Ancient station. The old train station on the outskirts of town had always been a place of mystery and whispers. It was a relic of the past, long abandoned, its tracks overgrown with weeds and the platform cracked and crumbling. Yet, for as long as anyone could remember, strange things were said to happen there, especially at night. Jack, a 15-year-old boy with a curiosity that often got him into trouble, had heard the stories all his life. Tales of ghostly figures seen wandering the platform, of trains that arrived with no passengers and departed just as mysteriously, and of a haunting, mournful whistle that echoed through the night air. His friends at school would sometimes dare each other to visit the station after dark, but none of them ever took the challenge seriously, except Jack. Jack was the kind of boy who didn't believe in ghosts or curses. He scoffed at the idea of haunted places and prided himself on being rational, a thinker who needed proof before he believed in anything. So, when the rumors of the station reached him again one summer evening, he decided to prove to himself, and to everyone else, that there was nothing to fear. It was a warm night in late July when Jack made up his mind. He told his parents he was going to a friend's house, packed a flashlight and his trusty pocketknife, and set off on his bike toward the station. The streets were quiet as he pedaled through town, the sky above darkening with the approaching night. The station lay beyond the town's edge, where the houses thinned out and the fields stretched on endlessly. As Jack neared the station, the once familiar landscape took on an eerie quality. The tall grasses whispered in the breeze, and the trees seemed to loom over the road like silent sentinels. The station itself appeared in the distance, a dark silhouette against the twilight sky. Jack's heart beat faster with a mix of excitement and apprehension, but he pressed on. When he arrived, the station was even more dilapidated than he had expected. The old building was covered in ivy, its windows shattered, and the sign that once proudly displayed the station's name was faded and barely legible. The platform was littered with debris, and the tracks, though still visible, were rusted and overgrown. Jack parked his bike and took out his flashlight. As he stepped onto the platform, a sudden chill ran down his spine. The air felt colder here, despite the warmth of the summer night. He shook off the feeling and switched on his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the empty platform and the surrounding tracks. Nothing here, he muttered to himself, trying to sound braver than he felt. He walked along the platform, the beam of his flashlight illuminating the crumbling walls and the remnants of old posters clinging to the bricks. There was an unsettling quietness about the place, a stillness that seemed unnatural. But Jack continued, determined to explore every corner of the station. He reached the end of the platform and was about to turn back when he heard something that made him freeze in his tracks, a faint, distant sound, like the whistle of a train. Jack frowned and turned off his flashlight, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and there was no mistaking it now. It was the unmistakable whistle of an approaching train. Jack's heart began to race. There were no trains scheduled to run through this station, not anymore. The tracks had been abandoned for years. He spun around, looking down the length of the tracks, expecting to see nothing but darkness. But to his astonishment, a light appeared in the distance, faint at first but growing steadily brighter. The whistle blew again, closer this time, and Jack's hands began to tremble. The light grew larger, heading straight for the station, and Jack felt a rising sense of dread. He wanted to run, to get as far away from the station as possible, but his feet wouldn't move. It was as if he were rooted to the spot, unable to tear his gaze away from the oncoming train. As the light approached, Jack could make out the shape of the train, an old-fashioned steam engine, billowing smoke into the night air. The sound of its wheels clattering against the tracks grew louder, almost deafening, and the ground beneath Jack's feet began to tremble. The train wasn't slowing down. It was heading straight for the platform, and Jack had nowhere to go. Just when it seemed the train would barrel through the station and collide with him, it screeched to a halt, sparks flying from the wheels as they ground against the rusty tracks. The train came to a stop with a final, piercing whistle, and for a moment, there was only silence. Jack stood frozen in place, staring up at the train in disbelief. It was massive, its black iron sides gleaming in the dim light, and its windows were dark and empty. The engine hissed as steam escaped from its vents, but there was no sign of a conductor, no sign of any passengers. The train was as lifeless as the station itself. He didn't know how long he stood there, paralyzed by fear and confusion, before the door of the nearest carriage slowly creaked open. A dim light spilled out onto the platform, casting long shadows, and Jack's breath caught in his throat. He peered into the darkness, expecting to see someone step out, but no one appeared. The carriage door remained open, a silent invitation. Against every instinct screaming at him to run, Jack took a hesitant step forward. The platform seemed to stretch on forever, each step feeling heavier than the last. He reached the open door, his heart pounding in his chest, and peered inside. The interior of the carriage was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was old, but not in the same decayed way as the station. The seats were covered in rich, red velvet, and the walls were adorned with ornate woodwork. A faint golden light illuminated the space, casting everything in a warm glow. But there was something off about it, something that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. He hesitated at the door, glancing back at the empty platform. Part of him wanted to turn around, to get back on his bike and leave this place behind, but something compelled him to enter. It was as if an unseen force was drawing him in, whispering promises of answers, of mysteries solved. Taking a deep breath, Jack stepped into the carriage. The door slid shut behind him with a soft click, and the train began to move. As the train lurched forward, Jack stumbled slightly, gripping the back of one of the velvet-covered seats for support. The interior of the carriage was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft rumble of the train as it picked up speed. He looked around, half expecting someone to emerge from the shadows, but the carriage remained empty. The warm, golden light that filled the space seemed to pulse gently, casting strange shadows on the walls. Jack moved cautiously down the aisle, his footsteps muffled by the plush carpet underfoot. The air inside the train was thick with an unfamiliar scent, something like old leather and a hint of perfume, as if the train carried the ghosts of past passengers. As he walked further down the carriage, Jack noticed that the windows were completely black, as if they had been painted over or covered from the outside. He couldn't see anything of the world beyond, only his own pale reflection staring back at him from the glass. The sensation of being trapped grew stronger, but there was nowhere else to go but forward. At the end of the carriage, another door led to the next compartment. Jack paused, his hand hovering over the handle. The whispers that had drawn him onto the train had faded, replaced by an almost oppressive silence. A chill crept up his spine as he turned the handle and pushed the door open. The next carriage was nearly identical to the first, with the same red velvet seats and warm lighting. But there was something different here, something that made Jack's heart race. The seats weren't empty. Each one was occupied by a figure, their faces turned away from him, staring blankly out the blackened windows. Jack froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figures were completely still, as if they were nothing more than mannequins, yet there was something unsettlingly lifelike about them. Their clothes were old-fashioned, the kind of attire his grandparents might have worn, faded suits, long dresses, and hats perched on their heads. "Hello." Jack called out, his voice trembling slightly. None of the figures moved. They remained frozen in place, their gazes fixed on the dark windows. Jack took a cautious step closer, his eyes scanning the rows of seats. There was something familiar about the figures, though he couldn't quite place it. As he passed by one of the seats, Jack's breath caught in his throat. The figure closest to him, a woman in a floral dress and a wide-brimmed hat, looked exactly like his mother. Her face was turned away, but the curve of her jaw, the color of her hair, it was as if she had stepped out of a photograph from when she was younger. "Mom?" Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he reached out a trembling hand to touch her shoulder. The moment his fingers brushed the fabric of her dress, the figure's head snapped around to face him. Jack stumbled back, his eyes widening in horror. It wasn't his mother. The face that stared back at him was grotesque, a twisted, decaying version of the woman he remembered. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets, and her skin was a sickly gray, pulled tight over her skull. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, revealing rows of rotting teeth. Jack's stomach turned as he backed away, the other figures now slowly turning their heads to look at him. Their faces were all the same, decayed, hollow-eyed, and expressionless, like something out of a nightmare. Jack's pulse raced as he realized he was surrounded, their empty gazes fixed on him. Panicking, Jack spun around and bolted toward the door at the far end of the carriage. His footsteps echoed in the confined space as he reached the door and yanked it open, stumbling into the next compartment. He slammed the door shut behind him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The third carriage was darker, the warm light now dim and flickering. The seats here were empty, but the walls were covered in old, tattered posters and newspaper clippings. Jack's hands shook as he scanned the walls, his eyes landing on one of the yellowed newspapers. The headline sent a jolt of fear through him: local family tragedy, parents lost in train accident, son missing. Jack's breath hitched as he read the article. It detailed a train derailment that had happened nearly 50 years ago. A family of 3, a mother, father, and their teenage son, had been aboard the train. The parents had been killed instantly in the crash, but the son's body had never been found. The article speculated that he might have wandered off, disoriented, or been thrown from the train. As Jack stared at the old photograph accompanying the article, his blood ran cold. The boy in the picture looked exactly like him, same dark hair, same wide eyes. It was as if he were looking at a ghost from the past, a mirror image of himself frozen in time. Before he could process what he was seeing, the train jolted violently, throwing Jack to the floor. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding, and rushed to the nearest window, trying to see what was happening. But the windows were still black, showing nothing of the world outside. The train began to pick up speed, faster and faster, the rumble of the wheels growing louder. Jack clung to the wall as the carriage rocked and swayed, the lights flickering overhead. Panic surged through him as the realization hit: the train was out of control. He had to find a way to stop it. He turned and ran toward the front of the train, hoping to reach the engine and somehow bring it to a halt. The carriages blurred by as he sprinted through them, each one more decayed and ruined than the last. The figures he passed grew more grotesque, their eyes following him, their twisted faces etched with expressions of despair. Finally, Jack burst into the engine room. It was dark, the only light coming from the glowing coals in the furnace. The controls were old and rusted, covered in grime, and the air was thick with the smell of burning coal. But there was no one there, no conductor, no engineer. The train was moving on its own. Desperation clawed at Jack as he fumbled with the controls, trying to find a way to stop the train. But nothing responded. The levers were stuck, the buttons unresponsive. The train barreled on, faster and faster, the sound of the wheels on the tracks deafening. Just when Jack thought all hope was lost, a shadowy figure appeared at the far end of the engine room. It was tall and shrouded in darkness, its features obscured by the flickering light. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the figure slowly approached, its movements deliberate and unnerving. "Who are you?" Jack demanded, his voice trembling with fear. The figure didn't respond. It moved closer, stepping into the dim light, and Jack's blood ran cold. The figure was a man, but his face was hidden beneath a hood, only the faint outline of his features visible. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and when he spoke, his voice was a low, guttural whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." Jack backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you want from me?" The figure stepped closer, and Jack felt the temperature in the room drop. "You've seen too much. This train carries the souls of the lost, those who can never leave. Now that you're here, you're one of us." "No!" Jack shouted, shaking his head in disbelief. "I'm not dead. I'm not like them." The figure tilted its head, a faint smile playing at the corners of its shadowed mouth. Not yet. Before Jack could react, the figure lunged at him, its hands outstretched. Jack ducked and tried to run, but the figure was faster, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him back. The touch was icy cold, searing his skin like frostbite. Jack struggled, kicking and thrashing, but the figure's grip was like iron. "You will join us," the figure hissed, dragging Jack toward the furnace. "You will never leave this train." Jack's mind raced as he fought against the overwhelming force. He knew he couldn't let this happen, he couldn't become one of the lost souls trapped on this ghostly train. In a last desperate act, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his knife, slashing at the figure's arm. The figure recoiled, hissing in pain, and Jack wrenched himself free. He bolted for the door, throwing it open and leaping out into the darkness. The world spun around him as he tumbled through the air, the train speeding away behind him. Then, with a bone-jarring thud, he hit the ground and everything went black. Jack awoke with a gasp, his body aching from the impact of his fall. For a moment, he lay still, disoriented and struggling to remember where he was. The last thing he recalled was the terror of the train, the ghostly figures, and his desperate escape. But as he blinked up at the dark sky above, he realized that he was no longer on the train. He was lying on cold, hard ground, surrounded by overgrown grass and weeds. Slowly, Jack sat up, wincing as pain shot through his limbs. His head throbbed, and his vision swam, but he forced himself to take in his surroundings. The night was eerily silent, the only sound the distant chirping of crickets. He was in a field, but not just any field. The overgrown tracks of the abandoned station were visible nearby, stretching off into the darkness. He must have been thrown from the train when he jumped. But as Jack tried to piece together what had happened, a sickening realization hit him. He had no idea how far the train had taken him, or even how long he had been unconscious. The station he had set out to explore felt like a distant memory, and the terror he had experienced on the train left him with a gnawing fear that he might never find his way back. Jack struggled to his feet, swaying unsteadily as he scanned the area. The night was heavy with an unnatural stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath. There was no sign of the train, no sign of the eerie figure that had chased him. But as he looked down the tracks, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. In the distance, far down the line, a faint light was flickering. He hesitated, a deep sense of dread filling him. Was it the same train, coming back to claim him? Or was it something else, something worse? But he had no other options. With no clear sense of direction and the possibility of that light leading him back to civilization, Jack forced himself to move forward. The walk down the tracks was agonizingly slow. Every step was a struggle, his body still weak and bruised. The air grew colder as he approached the light, and the oppressive silence seemed to deepen, pressing in on him from all sides. But the light grew brighter, and soon, Jack could make out the source, a small, weathered station, much like the one he had left behind, but somehow different. The station was illuminated by a single, flickering lantern hanging above the platform. The building was old and decrepit, its wooden walls sagging and its roof partially caved in. But unlike the station Jack had originally explored, this one was alive with an unsettling energy, a sense of something ancient and malevolent lurking just beneath the surface. Jack's pulse quickened as he reached the platform. The light from the lantern cast long, distorted shadows across the ground, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. He hesitated at the edge of the platform, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, to run as far away from this place as possible. But he knew there was no escape, he had to find out what was happening, to understand the nightmare he had been thrust into. As he stepped onto the platform, the lantern's light flickered again, casting the station into brief darkness. When the light returned, Jack froze. Standing at the far end of the platform, barely visible in the dim glow, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows, but there was something horribly familiar about it. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the figure began to move, gliding silently toward him. He wanted to run, but his legs refused to obey, his body paralyzed with fear. The figure drew closer, and as it stepped into the light, Jack's blood ran cold. It was the same figure from the train, the shadowy, hooded man who had tried to drag him into the furnace. But now, in the harsh light of the lantern, Jack could see more clearly. The figure's hood had fallen back, revealing a face that was both skeletal and decayed, its skin stretched tight over hollow bones. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "You thought you could escape," the figure rasped, its voice like the sound of rusted metal scraping against stone. "But there is no escape from the train. It always finds those it seeks." Jack's heart pounded in his chest, and he took a step back, his mind racing. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, though his voice trembled with fear. The figure's smile widened, its teeth yellowed and broken. "You are marked," it said, raising one skeletal hand to point at him. "The train claimed you the moment you set foot on that platform. Now, you belong to it." "No," Jack whispered, shaking his head in denial. "I won't go back. I won't let it take me." The figure's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jack thought he saw a flicker of something else in those glowing orbs, pity, perhaps, or maybe just a twisted amusement. "It is not a matter of choice," the figure said. "The train comes for those who are lost, those who have no place in the world of the living. It offers them a final journey, one that never ends." Jack's legs trembled as he backed away, his mind racing. He needed to get away from this place, away from this nightmare. But even as he thought of escape, he knew deep down that the figure was right. There was no way out. He was trapped, destined to ride the ghostly train for all eternity. The figure moved closer, its bony fingers reaching out for him. Jack's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he turned and ran, his feet pounding against the platform. The station seemed to stretch on forever, the exit just out of reach. Behind him, he could hear the figure's raspy breathing, its footsteps slow and deliberate. He reached the end of the platform and leapt down onto the tracks, his heart racing as he stumbled forward. The darkness closed in around him, the distant glow of the station growing fainter with each passing moment. But still, Jack ran, desperate to escape the horror that pursued him. As he sprinted down the tracks, the night air grew colder, the darkness pressing in on him like a suffocating blanket. The sound of the figure's footsteps echoed in his ears, growing louder, closer. Jack pushed himself to run faster, his lungs burning, but no matter how fast he went, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was running in circles, that the tracks were leading him back to where he had started. Suddenly, the sound of a train whistle pierced the air, high and shrill, cutting through the night like a blade. Jack's heart lurched as he skidded to a stop, the ground beneath his feet vibrating with the approach of something massive. He turned, his eyes wide with terror, and saw the train, his train, barreling toward him down the tracks. The engine's light blazed through the darkness, its whistle screaming as it bore down on him. Jack's mind screamed at him to move, to get off the tracks, but his body refused to obey. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear as the train rushed closer, its black iron sides gleaming in the moonlight. At the last possible moment, Jack threw himself to the side, rolling down the embankment just as the train roared past. The ground shook beneath him, and the air was filled with the deafening clatter of wheels on metal. Jack curled into a ball, covering his head with his arms as the train thundered by, its carriages a blur of darkness and light. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the train was gone. The night was silent once more, the tracks empty and still. Jack slowly uncurled himself, his heart pounding in his chest, and looked up. The train had vanished, leaving no trace of its passage. For a long moment, Jack lay there, gasping for breath, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Had he imagined it all? Was this some kind of twisted dream? But as he slowly got to his feet, his body aching and bruised, he knew that it was real. The train was real, and it was coming for him. Jack stumbled back up to the tracks, his mind racing. He had to keep moving, had to find a way out of this nightmare. But as he looked down the tracks, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the distance, where the station had once stood, there was now nothing but darkness. The light, the figure, the station, it was all gone, swallowed by the night. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he turned and ran, his footsteps echoing on the tracks. He had no idea where he was going, no idea how to escape, but he knew he couldn't stop. He couldn't let the train catch him again. He had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of the darkness that pursued him. As he ran, the night seemed to close in around him, the darkness growing thicker, more oppressive. The air grew colder, and Jack could feel the presence of something malevolent pressing down on him, suffocating him. The tracks stretched on endlessly, and no matter how far he ran, there was no end in sight. And then, just when Jack thought he couldn't go any further, he saw it, a faint light in the distance, flick.